Hi, everyone. We are live today with our continuation of menopause myths. So this one is calling it the menopause mythbuster, number one, talking about when it actually starts. So just to give a review of last week's session, we talked about really all the myths that are out there. And in review of 27 different articles on the web, there were 167 myths that were addressing and everyone's really concerned about. And those really fell into four categories. So the first was status. When does it happen? At what age? How will I know? The second was what's it going to be like? Basically, what are the symptoms? What can I expect? And the third big chunk was what can I do about it? And that is treatments. That conversation or those lists of myths are really around understanding efficacy for hormone replacement therapy or HRT, which is a very top of mind treatment for women and still yet not fully understood. So there's a lot of controversy or uncertainty around whether or not HRT is the right treatment for women in general and then for a woman individually. And the fourth grouping is really kind of like amalgam of a lot of, I would put them kind of lifestyle issues, which is what happens to my sex life? Will I gain weight? Can I get pregnant? And some things around fear, not knowing what's going to happen. And if you step back and think about all these myths, they all are really reasonable. When's it going to happen? What's it going to be like? What can I do about it? And then how's it going to impact really important things in my life? So I think that understanding that is the first step. What I wanted to do today was break down the first category, which is rather questions around status. And one of the big questions is menopause starts at 50. And what I want to point out is like a very simplistic thing to say menopause starts at 50. But in fact, menopause doesn't necessarily start at 50. Where I wanted to start the conversation around that is always step back around the term menopause. So menopause is both an anniversary date and a journey. So the anniversary date, similar to when we go through puberty, you think about menopause like a puberty where there's a significant hormonal change in a woman's body and it transforms her body. And puberty is marked really by the first menstrual period, and then menopause is the last. So menopause again is the 12-month anniversary from the last menstrual period. So you're fully finished with menstruating, and that's one definition of menopause. The other is this journey, so this long journey. So it's impossible to say that it happens specifically at an age because all women are different. And then also to think about how menopause occurs in the body, it takes a long time. So it's not that clear cut. So that's the first thing. Another question is around when you'll know it'll happen and how do you determine it's happening and if there are tests for it. So looking at how do you know it's happening and testing, they kind of go hand in hand. There isn't a standard practice around testing. So there are key hormones that are tests to indicate when a woman is losing fertility ability and moving into menopause status. One is called follicle stimulating hormone. And that's a hormone that comes out of the pituitary gland, gets sent to the ovaries, and that starts follicle production, and the follicle production results in estrogen. So when that hormone goes really high, it is an indication that it's continually have to send messages to the ovary to do its thing, and then we're not seeing that much estrogen. So high FSH is indicative of like losing fertility and then butting up against menopause. But there's not a clear cut number because everything's relative to a woman's kind of entire adult life and her whole menstruation history. So that's one. The other is AMH, which is a hormone that indicates the ovarian reserve. And that also changes and moves down as women age. And it's mostly tested around fertility and sometimes can be tested for menopause. But again, so there's not really a standard procedure or protocol around testing. Furthermore, most practitioners don't really rely on tests. What they rely on are women to come in and present with symptoms and describe them in a way that they can determine what's going on. So it's a little bit, rather, it's kind of entirely subjective. And hopefully, over time, as we get more and more data, that will change. So that's one thing, testing. But what that leans into is the idea of how do you know it starts? It starts with symptoms. And the challenge there is for women to be aware enough that they understand when things are changing. And the other challenge is the first thing that kicks off really is that periods get a little wonky. So PMS worsens, periods get heavier, they get closer. And so oftentimes women are a bit bamboozled because it just seems like maybe a wonky period in your mid 40s. And we often just write it off. And it's not until it gets really disruptive or kind of a pain in the ass that women start to pay attention to it. And so that's the challenge. One of the hallmark symptoms, as we know, is hot flash. And that is one of the things that's a little more clear marker that we're in the hormonal change, starting in perimenopause, moving into menopause when periods stop, and then being in postmenopause. So there are more kind of key marker things. One of the other things is with symptoms is anxiety, anger, depressive cycles also increase. Again, hard to um, really pull that away and say this is specifically to menopause because there are internal factors as well as external factors that cause those emotional fluctuations. So that's another thing about symptoms and how we as individual women figure it out is we just have to pay attention. So our own self-awareness is absolutely critical to understanding the transition and understanding where the changes are so we can identify what we can do about it. Then one of the common myths is that it happens suddenly. And again, with the information I just shared, is that it doesn't actually happen suddenly. I was thinking about the phrase of overnight success, and I think there's a Thomas Edison quote that overnight success takes 20 years. So there's a thing that's just happening, and at one point we recognize it, and then at one point we determine oh, the shit is on, and so we start paying attention. So it seems sudden because it's a sudden mind shift, but in fact the body's on a slow change over many years to get to its final change. So that's one. So let's go back to age. The number that is really easy to glom onto is the average age of 51. So to add a little color to that is the average age is when menopause hits, which is 12-month anniversary from the last menstrual period. Is the average age is 51 in the U.S. and U.K. So the median age is 50-51. In Europe, the median age is a little bit wider, so there's more variation of when it hits. So it's 50 to 53. In Latin America, it's actually earlier. So I think if I look at my notes, Latin America, the median age range is from 44 to 53. And then for Asia, it's a smaller age range and also a little bit earlier, 42 to 49. And so that's one thing to consider that impacts age. The other is there's a lot of information regarding whether you're in an industrialized country, whether you are in urban or rural environment, whether your socioeconomic status also impacts it. And these are they're interesting things to know. They're not necessarily drivers. What I would suggest is understanding that as a factor, but not as a driving factor. And really thinking about late 40s, early 50s, when the changes are going to happen, the symptoms will occur, and you will hit menopause. Just got a message here from April. Yeah, exactly. So April's experienced a really common thing, which is you don't really understand you're in perimenopause because you've been not sleeping very much or starting to feel warm at night. And then you get all these other things as well. And then you think okay, now I get it. Something's happening, and we start paying better attention. So that's the key, paying attention to our own symptoms. The other things that had come up in the myths around status, how do we know? One is, there are a lot about these, if I had my period earlier, I'm going to have menopause earlier, and if I have my period later, I'm going to hit menopause later. And it seems really reasonable, but in fact, there's not any conclusive evidence that that is the case. And there was some research that, as all good research is, like points to it, the one conclusion, and then the other research refutes it. And so it's hard to say at this point really what that is all about. The other thing is we want to, so the whole impetus is we want to understand what it's going to be like and when it's going to happen. So if I had my period really early, am I going to expect it earlier than normal? And one of the research studies, which is cool because they got to a number, but I want to illuminate it another way. So they said if you had a period like around 16, 17, your the menopause would hit like a year later than the average. Then if you had your period under 13, it also came a little bit earlier. And so what okay, so that's like kind of good to know, but the reality is like we're really fixated on this one thing, like when we started and when we're going to end. And for a like 4 year over 4 year difference on when women started their period, there's only like a 1 or 2 year difference in when menopause hits. So in my view, looking at that the data in that way is that it's really not that important. We shouldn't really worry about it because it's just kind of happened in our late 40s, early 50s. I know it's simplistic, but I think it's a matter of attention and efficiency of energy. Then the other thing is around what happened to your mother. And it's in my view, it's like a little bit romantic. Like what happened to my mother is always going to happen to me, and genetically we're so close. There is some indication that there is a relationship genetically, so between your mother and you, what would happen. One again, the idea that it's important to know, but I kind of think like you just pay attention, it's going to happen eventually, and not get too wound up about it. The other thing is, April mentioned that her mom, she asked her mom and then she doesn't really remember. So one of the challenges about asking our mother about what she went through is her social circumstance. I think menopause has so much social stigma now. It had even more a generation ago. One. Two is we modern women have more self-awareness than women did in general. Of course, there are outliers, more self-awareness than women did then, and understanding when her periods even stopped, when symptoms started, when they ended. A lot of that is not information that is that accessible or reliable, and so I would just say it's like really not that important. Also, one thing to note is, and this is an entirely different topic, it's about hysterectomy. When I've talked to a lot of women around understanding their menopause and asking, like, I've asked my mother if she could tell me anything about it, there's a high proportion of women who are our mother's age that have had hysterectomy. So it's not possible to tell when a natural menopause would happen based on that. And so, again, a whole nother topic, but something just to note. So that's kind of where we are with status, thinking about when it happens. So depending, there's some indication on ethnicity, when it's earlier or later. Some factors on being an urban or rural, some factors on socioeconomic status, industrialized nation versus emerging nation, and those all make sense logically. But again, I urge us not to get super wrapped up in just what the data is and pay attention to what's happening to ourselves. And then the other thing is, just I'd say like at a more high level note, is the myth of menopause starts at 50. When I think about that, I see it from a couple of perspectives. One is, what does 50 mean? I think socially, 50 is kind of the start of the end. So we think like, oh shit, here we go, 50, like it's all gonna stop now. And I think that's a social construct that's starting to change with modern women who are 50 and don't really align with the historical brand of 50-year-old woman. I count myself among them, being 52. So that's something that I think is an interesting thread through why like 50 is the answer, because we think that that's kind of the end of who we are and not know what's going next. So it's very convenient. And the other thing, as we talked about, was, or that was in the myths, was that it just happened suddenly, right? The fact, and I talked about this just earlier, that it's like, it just all of a sudden, like, I'm this person, then I'm not this person, I'm in this hormonal state, and then I'm this whole other thing, when it's really a slow transition. And what I like about the idea that of a transition is, as we individually pay attention to what's going on, is that we are then able to accumulate information, understand our life experiences, so that we can be prepared for what's happening and then build a foundation for life post menopause. So I will leave it at that for today. Again, busting the myth. That was like Mythbuster, busting the myth regarding when menopause starts. It's not. I don't have specific, really incontrovertible data around when it starts and how it affects people, how it affects people with uteruses and ovaries, but it is really about understanding what's going on in ourselves, tracking the symptoms, and pulling in as much outside and useful information that will help us in our own journeys. So that's what I have for you today, and we'll see you all next week. Next week, I want to talk about bones and bone health. Actually, no, I'm supposed to do Mythbuster number 2. So let's do Mythbuster number 2, and I'll sneak in some information around bones. So Mythbuster number 2 will be about symptoms, and we'll dig deep into that next week. Okay, bye.